Hey guys, so last year I started 2022 off with a way too long, in-depth look at the world building and power scaling of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Truth be told, it was a freaking joy to make as a video because I think out of every medium of storytelling that I come across, cartoons just might be my all-time favorite. Video games are right there, but cartoons have this special way of really tickling that shriveled up baby Voldemort corpse of the inner child that's buried somewhere deep inside of you. So naturally, over the holiday season, I sought out another good cartoon to watch, and I did so because I felt I needed a palate cleanser after seeing Black Panther, Black Adam, Avatar 2, and Glass Onion. I needed something a little more low-key to break up the insanity of those high-octane movies, so seeing as how, for some reason, the full special is just free on YouTube, I decided to watch the Billy and Mandy Save Christmas special as my relaxing nostalgia palate cleanser. And oh my gosh, what a mistake that was, because I had no idea what I was getting into. I was very forcefully reminded that the Billy and Mandy Christmas episode is one of the strangest, most ludicrous holiday specials I have ever seen, and is so bonkers that it somehow manages to be more entertaining than Black Adam and Avatar 2 combined. And yes, I suppose I will have to make a video on those movies as well, but that's for another day. One of the curses of being both a professional editor and an author is that it's one of those mindsets you just kind of can't turn off. You become so in tune with the structure of tropes and craft and storytelling that every narrative you interact with becomes a subject of study and scrutiny. And I guess that's partly why I love cartoons so much. They allow me to smooth out my brain a bit and dissociate compared to more serious live action or literary fiction. So of course, sitting down to watch the Billy and Mandy Save Christmas special, the idea was to go slack-jawed while gluttonously stuffed full of Christmas prime rib and mashed potatoes so that a silly animation from my childhood could whisk me away to a land of laughter and nostalgia. And don't get me wrong, it definitely did do that. But thanks to the hamster in my editor's brain that never gets off the wheel, I couldn't help but notice subtle, subversive material that ranged from social commentary to literary critiques to deconstructions of long-standing fictional tropes. So today, we'll feature yet another way too long in-depth video about an animation from our childhoods. But before we do that, I did want to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Babbel. If you have a New Year's resolution to travel to new places or learn a new language, Babbel has got you covered. Babbel teaches you to speak using real conversations that you might hear every day, and even if you are in a time crunch, the lessons are just about 10 minutes short and highly interactive. If you put in the work and stick with the lessons, you could even start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. And the reason is because Babbel caters to many different ways to learn. They have traditional linguistic walkthroughs, but also podcasts and even games. And best of all, it all comes with a 20-day money-back guarantee. I myself have a love for Italian, and Babbel is definitely helping me stay in the groove. Andrò in italiano un giorno, lo prometto. And because I'd like to hook you guys up, if you use my link in the description or the screen code, you will get 60% off your purchase. So go ahead and try Babbel today. Now, getting back to Billy and Mandy, the first way to dissect this crazy movie isn't even by examining the content of the narrative, but establishing how we are even going to interpret the content at all. And yeah, I know that sounds weird because Billy and Mandy Save Christmas shouldn't need interpretation at all. It's supposed to be a straightforward animation made for 10-year-olds. But it's that very veneer of simplicity that can keep you from unearthing or appreciating some of the cool moments within the fiction. This is one of those times that, despite the silliness of the fiction and the genre it resides in, there are a great many writing lessons and examples of execution within for those of you hoping to educate yourself or become better in writing. And to that end, we must do a close reading of the text. Now, I almost threw up in my mouth a little bit from how pretentious that sounded, but hear me out. The term close reading of the text does not refer just to recognizing philosophy and themes in written material. A close reading of the text means an unpacking of the implicit or unsaid messages of any fictional material. So the text here would be the Billy and Mandy Christmas special. And a close reading of it would require us to not only look at the actual events and character journeys that occurred, but the broader implications, endorsed morality, and outcomes of those events and journeys. So what we are doing isn't so much critiquing the plot or even looking at the literal circumstances of the characters and how they find themselves in, because a literal interpretation of the Christmas special offers no lessons or subversions because it is a silly, completely farcical adventure. So instead, we must look deeper to how the Christmas special makes meta-commentary on itself, makes commentary on other similar fictions, and makes a commentary on our biased expectations as viewers, and makes a commentary on broad social issues, all through subversion. Yeah, didn't think you were gonna get that in this video, and really neither did I when I sat down to watch, but here we are. Now, I mentioned two terms, meta-commentary and subversion. These are very important, very popular terms, but just in case we're not familiar, let's talk about them. Meta-commentary is how a piece of fiction refers to its own state of being. It's self-referential. Meta means within. But, and this is really important, there are different ways for a fiction to be meta. A fiction can be meta by broadly and generally commenting on its own status as a fiction without acknowledging it is a fiction. A great example of this is Mrs. Incredible talking to her children about cartoon villains.
Remember the bad guys on those shows you used to watch on Saturday mornings? Well, these guys are not like those guys. They won't exercise restraint because you're children. They will kill you if they get...
The very Saturday morning cartoons that Mrs. Incredible is talking about are exactly the same type of fictions that she belongs in herself. She is one of the voices in the chorus of her own fiction. They understand that they are making a cartoon with villains just like the ones they are critiquing. But the meta-commentary is used to raise the stakes because The Incredibles as a fiction is using Mrs. Incredible's words to tell you, the viewer, that it is quite different from other fictions you might be acquainted with. Yet it does all this within the context of its own consistent world without acknowledging its own status as a fiction. A more popular and widely used meta-commentary is the fourth wall break, where a character directly addresses the audience because they know and admit that they are in a fiction. This can either come in the form of one-off jokes or entire inner monologues a la Malcolm in the Middle or House of Cards.
There can be no false steps now. The higher up the mountain, the more treacherous the path. Good things happen to good people.
Avoid wars you can't win and never raise your flag for an asinine cause like slavery.
And honestly, there are many other types of meta-commentary revolving around critiquing genre, or tropes, or even time periods, but they aren't important for this video. All you need to know is that meta-commentary is important due to its ability to play with the viewer's expectations and challenge their ideas of what can or cannot happen in your fiction. Meta-commentary calls into question the very rules and conventions of every level of storytelling, effectively taking off the guardrails so the viewer becomes open to anything happening. And to that end, we can talk about subversion, which is closely related to meta-commentary. Where meta-commentary is a fiction making some sort of statement about its own being, subversion is when a fiction shows a viewer something different than what the viewer has been told to expect. All meta-commentary is a type of subversion, but not all subversions are meta-commentaries, and subversions can be done for multiple reasons. A subversion can be story-specific, meaning that the singular narrative sets up an expectation so that it can subvert that and have a shocking revelation or surprise. This is super typical in most modern-era thrillers. For example, in the, spoilers, 2011 Sherlock Holmes sequel, the film completely sets up the expectation in the viewer for us to understand Sherlock is dead.
Conclusion inevitable. Unless...
I mean, he fell off a cliff, so why not? But then our expectations are subverted when he's revealed to be alive. This happens in countless films or just stories in general where the plot sets up A only to deliver us with B. That is subversion. Or there is another type of subversion that is called extra narrative, meaning that the expectation was set up by some force outside of the story, such as the genre or the culture. A demonstration of this is at the end of, spoilers, Get Out. Our main character has killed his psycho kidnapper girlfriend, but a cop car rolls up on the scene. The arisen expectation here is a cultural and societal one. A cop is going to see a black man standing next to a dead white woman and think she is the victim. Seeing the cop car triggers the expectation that the main character is in peril, even though the movie itself did not set up this expectation. But then we get the subversion where it's not actually the cop, but the main character's friend. This is extra narrative subversion. This type of subversion is also often used when attempting to critique or redefine storytelling genres or long-held storytelling beliefs. Knives Out is an example of a fiction that completely subverts the murder mystery genre of storytelling. There are certain tropes and cliches that are ubiquitous across almost all murder mysteries, causing viewers to expect them. But Knives Out and subsequently Glass Onion, albeit in a different way, works to tell a murder mystery through deconstructing all the typical conventions and expectations that the genre brings with it.
The family had gathered to celebrate your father's 85th birthday. How was it, by the way?
The party? Pre my dad's death? Oh, it was great.
And to go broader outside of even genre, there are fictions that subvert storytelling structure as a whole. We can look to one of the most famous examples of this, Memento. Traditional storytelling dogma holds that narratives progress linearly across time, starting at the introduction, moving through the midsection and character growth, and ending with an exciting or emotional climax. Memento completely subverts this broad general storytelling belief by presenting its story backwards. We start at the ending events of our main character's story and sequentially reverse from there. Now, it should be noted that technically, Memento still does follow a traditional story structure of introduction, midsection, climax, but that's almost more impressive considering it does so in reverse plot order, but again, that's another video for another day.
You don't remember where you've been or what you've just done.
I can't make new memories. Everything just fades.
What's the last thing you do remember?
My wife
That's sweet.
died.
All in all, this section of explanation is simply meant to detail why subversion happens in the first place and how it may present. Subversion on the highest level is meant to critique societal expectations that have been reestablished and reaffirmed multiple times by fictions across generations. Subversions like this are the highest form and therefore most difficult to pull off because they innately run counterintuitive to not only the traditions of storytelling, but also the ideas that the general public has for how certain aspects of reality are presented. For example, Frozen became such a huge hit not only for the world-class singing by Idina Menzel, but because it subverted the long-standing trope of female actualization and fulfillment by virtue of a man. There's a pervasive narrative cycle where stories reflect a facet of reality, and then due to the viewing of those stories, people hold those morals and values even firmer, which in turn causes reality to be more like the stories, especially when those stories are shown to children who adopt those beliefs to be the bedrock of their worldview. One of these long-standing societal and narrative beliefs was that people, specifically and especially women, could fix the problems of their life and inner conflict through successful romance. Animation has a healthy history of both leading women and secondary female characters largely becoming content and happy because of their partnering with a man. Their romance is either fulfilled during the climax, which gives them the inner power and self-confidence to overcome their greatest challenge, or the romance is fulfilled after the climax and works as a sort of existential, natural reward or validation for them overcoming their greatest challenge. For a long time, women in fiction have had their storylines centered around, or at least highly involved with romance. When a leading animated female character appears on screen, an audience is immediately and effortlessly drawn to think of how she will interact with the eventual theoretical love interest. It's one of the most common tropes in all of storytelling, especially when that female character loses her agency in the process. Seeing this type of storyline over and over and over again can start to teach audiences that feminine problems are solved by romance, or that a woman's goal should be romance, or that romance is a reward for good deeds. And this isn't meant to be a preachy, woke gospel so much as a recognition of how these subtle, pervasive beliefs and tropes can poison the well of storytelling for fictions that we hold dear. A great example of this is the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Rey kisses Kylo in the final minutes of the third movie for what seems like no reason. But the reason was because, since the writers had no idea what they were doing with their narrative anymore, they had to fall back onto tropes and cliches in an attempt to create connective tissue between the disparate and confused narrative plot lines. And one of those plot lines manifested as Rey is woman, woman equal romance, and she kisses Kylo Ren, even though that makes no sense for either of their characters. So I really want to emphasize this. This isn't a social justice thing, this is a I don't want my stories to be boring as piss thing, and cliche female characters who exist to be in a relationship are boring as a piss storm. So that's what leads us back to Frozen, and the contributing factors to why it felt like such a breath of fresh air, when in actuality it was just a decent to good Disney movie with an incredibly talented voice cast. Frozen completely played into the stereotypical trope of a female character needing her quite literal Prince Charming to fix the ails of her life, but then subverted that expectation and that trope completely by not only justifying the position that an independent woman is not some wicked force of nature, but also by representing the institution of female romantic necessity as the villain itself. The Prince Charming ends up being the antagonist. The two leading female characters quite literally see the insidious nature of love at first sight romances and end the narrative rejecting and defeating the personification of that idea. This storyline goes against almost every single romantic representation that Disney put out prior, and because of that, it inspired watchers to consider the value in not needing romance to fix your life, and the power that comes with personal independence and confidence. Now, am I saying that romance is bad and no one should do it? No. And neither is Frozen. But that's the awesome thing about narrative subversion. Its highest form gives the ability to comment on some specific nuanced aspect of society that have typically been reinforced by cliche storytelling and provide a new example of how people can more functionally live their lives and interpret their perceptions. Now, why is all of this information about meta-narratives and subversion important for understanding the writing of the Billy and Mandy Christmas special? It's because that subversion and meta-narratives are essentially the only way to genuinely and effectively frame an argument that will resonate with both sides of a social issue. What do I mean by this? Well, for any social issue that fiction might comment on, there are those that have lived through the detriments of the social issue and recognize it to be real and in need of change. And there are those on the opposite side who disregard the validity or danger of the social issue. But strangely enough, one side is not easier than the other to win over. You may think that those people that already know the danger of the issue you are making commentary on would automatically back you up, but that's a common fallacy that many authors succumb to. And that's because they do not write on those issues from a genuine perspective. Many movies, books, TV shows, or video games, whatever, will center their narratives around a progressive message on some racial, cultural, economic, sexual, or spiritual issue, but then not actually execute any real helpful commentary on it. The live-action Jungle Book from 2016 is a great example. The entire story is Mowgli's belonging with the animals of the forest. Shere Khan, the villain and therefore the character representing the negative, bad point of view, believes that Mowgli should stay with his own kind.
When was it we came to adopt man into the jungle?
He's just a cub.
Does my face not remind you of what a grown man can do?
Shere Khan has an overt racial prejudice that mankind is innately destructive and should not intermingle with the forest animals. Basically, he hates Mowgli for how he was born, just for being Mowgli. Shere Khan is a segregationist. Making a person with this kind of mindset the villain works well. Racist individuals who want exclusionary, ethnically pure societies should be portrayed in a negative light. However, the eventual catastrophic problem with the social commentary within this narrative is that Mowgli does burn down the forest. Now, of course, he does it on accident, but for the messages of the film, that doesn't matter. By having Mowgli, the unwanted outsider, unwittingly destroy his community and displace hundreds of natives around him, the narrative effectively validates Shere Khan's prejudice and exclusionary mindset. Mowgli proves the villain right. Shere Khan believed that it was in Mowgli's nature, his very DNA, to be destructive. Shere Khan thought it was a matter of when Mowgli would cause harm, not if, and didn't even think it would be a conscious effort on Mowgli's part because destruction is simply the nature of man. Sure, I guess the movie can still have a message of not judging an entire group of people because of the mistakes of a single child of that group, but that's not what the core message and conflict of the movie was about. The Jungle Book was about Mowgli being able to exist harmoniously with nature even though he himself wasn't an animal. Yet the film's climax sees him destroy nature. Is the message of the film then supposed to be that humans are innately destructive? Is it meant to illustrate that we aren't supposed to coexist with nature and animals? Or is the worst possible scenario that it's actually about like kinds should only live together? Whatever the case may be, even people who are against segregation and racial purity would not be able to resonate with the narrative message. And on the flip side, you have messages that do gain the approval of those suffering through the targeted social issue, but the way the message is conveyed is so explicit and dogmatic that it cannot possibly convince those who discredit the social issue to begin with. A great example of this is the Infinity War scene, where all the female heroes are given their moment to show their combined girl power.
She's got help.
For people who understand that women are typically represented in fiction to be powerless and without agency, this moment was a cool to decent way of showcasing competent, effective female characters. However, it was also completely obtrusive and generally unearned, so for viewers who don't recognize there to be a problem with female representation in fiction, it comes off as Hollywood ham-fistedly preaching to them about how awesome and strong women are, without any real narrative substance to give weight to the message. Nobody who thought less of women or the struggles they endure would have changed their minds because of Endgame. It was a completely cynical, pandering focus on female empowerment that seemed inserted for politics rather than the story. And lastly, I will say that social commentary within fiction can choose to cater to whatever side of the issue it wants. That's the freedom of writing. Some people don't want to concern themselves with how the opposition to the issue that they deal with will perceive their story. They just want to write a story about the issue, and that's fine. Still, for those writers working to convince the largest group of people with the most genuine social commentary possible, it is incumbent upon you to understand the execution of meta-commentary and subversion. Because only through the use of these subtle, covert literary techniques can a person be swayed to consider a new viewpoint without raising their defenses and digging in their heels. To get back to Get Out, it's a phenomenal example of this. The entire narrative was an allegorical social critique of the use of black bodies and the way the black experience is viewed and altered by the white community. The movie literally has white people abducting and taking over black people. But the movie's conflict was never overtly about racial issues. All the tension and messaging was framed as a single man's personal struggle through the horror of his capture and his drive to escape and stay alive. By making the social commentary secondary to the believable struggle of the main character, an audience can accept the validity of his conflict and therefore the reflection on reality for what that struggle means.
Shit! Chris!
And the reason that I have been constantly referencing women's issues and issues of otherism and racism across this video is because those are the exact social issues that the Billy and Mandy Christmas special deals with in a subtle, covert way. By being able to genuinely represent the problems and limitations that social issues bring, Billy and Mandy Saves Christmas lays out its messaging in a way that any person can understand because the commentary itself is based in the believable and understandable conflict of the characters themselves. Just speaking from a narrative level now, the Christmas special sets itself up as a trope-heavy adventure story in order to then subvert that premise. Like, the purposeful application of cliches is nonstop. Some mystery antagonist has threatened Christmas itself in a Christmas movie. I'm sure we haven't seen that before 1,000 times, and Santa is at risk of not being able to deliver the Christmas presents. Haven't seen that before. The whole vampire thing, I will admit, is a huge twist, and definitely is not something that I was expecting when I first watched it as a child, even though I guess there were commercials of it. But even then, the story sets itself up as trope central, even within like those parameters. Mrs. Claus is established as the hapless, damsel in distress housewife that needs the lovable, gullible comic relief character to help her with her menial chores, while the competent, effective characters handle the true conflict. And the true conflict is introduced as the stereotypical head vampire huntdown. And again, I'm not being interpretive when I say that the special is purposefully setting up trope-heavy introductions in order to subvert them later. It is open, honest, and aware of what it is doing. It literally has meta-commentary on its own cliche nature in the face of common writing conventions.
You're not going to use that on my Santa, are you?
No, we need to find the head vampire and eliminate him. That always works in the movies.
And during the same sequence, we are introduced to vampires as the cliché others, who are all bad, malicious, evil, and deserve our hatred. And again, the fiction understands this by having a character within openly state the targeted worldview.
I always hated the living undead, wandering around, all dead but alive. Makes a mockery of my job.
But it's only at the start of the second act do we get to see just how bonkers and subversive this special actually is. First off, when Mandy goes to kill the head vampire, Baron von Ghoulish, he just comes back to life and mocks her attempts. Then we learn that he really isn't even the head vampire. There's some other, more authoritative head vampire lying in wait, which is of course a mockery of the idea of a head vampire in the first place. It's kind of like meta-commentary in and of itself.
Besides, you don't want the head vampire. You want the head vampire.
The head vampire?
Yes, they did this whole reorganization thing a couple of 100 years ago. Doesn't make much sense to me, eh?
Then we learn that Mrs. Claus, the sad, scared housewife and victim, is actually the head vampire and the person who turned to Santa, making her the real villain of the entire story. It's a complete subversion of her damsel in distress position, revealing her to actually have a ton of agency and power as a woman, more than anyone else in the story actually. And then, through a concerted close reading of the text, this whole narrative turns out to be a very subtle meta-commentary and subversion based on social issues surrounding gender stereotypes. Mrs. Claus began the film as the damsel in distress who lacked agency and needed others to solve her problems for her, a very common trope. But beyond that, she also admits to having lived hundreds of years as the most stereotypical, traditionalist, underappreciated housewife. For centuries, in her own words, she had been working her fingers to the bone, making sure that everything in the North Pole and the household worked correctly. All the while, Santa remained obsessed with the quote-unquote real work of Christmas, pertaining to checking his naughty list, not once recognizing all the work Mrs. Claus was doing. When you take a step back, you realize that this was and is the exact type of lifestyle that some women have actually been saddled with. They are meant to take care of the household duties. The belief is that their job is doing that, and it's their place in the family structure, and they shouldn't be praised or recognized for it. Miss Claus in this Billy and Mandy Christmas special is literally being used as a representative for the broad social issues of women being seen as household commodities by their husbands. Her tragic Thanos backstory, what turned her to villainy, was the patriarchy itself, or at least a subtle generalization of it. It was a system that commodified Miss Claus into being little more than a household servant, while benefiting Santa in a way which he might not have even recognized. Miss Claus doesn't turn Santa into a vampire because she's some dastardly machinations. She does it because she wants to break out of the cycle of just working all the time and being treated like garbage. She's not just a villain, she is understandable, relatable, and an allegory for many people who have lived her same experience. But the genius nature of the Christmas special is that, again, it is not preachy. It does not frame itself overtly as making a broad social commentary. It simply shows the experience of individuals and allows we, the viewers, to relate that applicable information to social issues. But furthermore, it's not dogmatic in its approach either. It plays to convince both sides. Miss Claus, while being understandable and relatable, is not right. It is not justified to forcibly alter the mind of your spouse and lock them in a basement because you are dissatisfied with the relationship. Even though Santa was certainly in the wrong for how he treated Miss Claus, her victimhood does not give her an excuse or the right to react equally unhealthily. Women wronged by men don't become god queens who can dispense abuse and retribution as they see fit. And make no mistake, this was as close to a portrait of an abusive marriage that you were going to get from Cartoon Network. The Claus marriage was this cyclical whirlpool of abuse and neglect, where Santa would sink into a workaholic frenzy, leaving Miss Claus alone and isolated, prompting her to essentially kidnap and torture him until she found she had had enough of a respite, only for him to go back into behaving the exact same way as before, restarting the cycle that was eroding their relationship. The end of the special shows that Santa and Mrs. Claus were not communicating at all about the issues that they were facing. Santa reacts as if he has never heard about the horrible work pressure Miss Claus has been facing. He literally just didn't know. Of course, it's a very simplified example of overcoming marital woes and deconstructing patriarchal systems, but it still works in the grand scheme of things, especially considering this was a 45-minute special. The entire depiction of the Claus marriage was that neither of the two were evil or unreasonable. They were simply people with the capacity for love, but people who created and maintained a harmful system of oppression without meaning to. The film makes it clear that Santa never wanted Mrs. Claus to feel used because he loved her. But that's the same way that many men don't actively create an environment where the women in their lives are miserable, but it still happens anyway. And Mrs. Claus never spoke up and advocated for herself within the oppressive system. Instead, she used passive-aggressive methods and psychological manipulation to get what she wanted. But those tactics never solved the issue. They are temporarily addressing the symptoms, but not in any permanent, real way. It wasn't until they finally talked and Santa admitted that he had unwittingly created a harmful system through his neglect and entitlement that Mrs. Claus realized how wrong her own response had been, allowing them to agree to support each other and create a system that benefits them both. And that healthy compromise manifests as a man with a passion for helping Miss Claus with all of her cleaning and housework. Baron von Gulish. It's the final awesome ribbon on the gender critique, where the subtle messaging is that there is no such thing as gendered roles in the first place. Baron von Gulish is a man, but he is posh and prissy and a neat freak. But that doesn't make him any less of a man. The work that Mrs. Claus was doing wasn't women's work, it was just work. And Baron von Gulish willingly helping her because he wants to signifies that any passion is not specific to what you identify as. Passion is passion, and you can follow that as long as you're pulled to. And all this links up beautifully with the film's subtle critique against otherism as well, where we see an outside group as innately lesser or even evil. Again, vampires are set up in this film to be bad, to be hated, to be the antagonist, but that's not actually what we see at all. Baron von Gulish is totally unthreatening and doesn't have a malicious bone in his body. And Mrs. Claus may be the villain, but she didn't do what she did because she was a vampire. She did what she did because she was fed up with her situation. Cartoon villains are almost always evil for the sake of evil. Like, it's literally where the term cartoonishly evil comes from. And for many cartoons, that works. Cartoons can represent the simplicity of some moral lessons through straightforward character archetypes. Some people are so corrupt and militant that they cannot be reasoned with, only defeated and kept from hurting others. Some people are courageous and virtuous and have hearts of gold that stand with the innocent even to their own detriment. Those extremes exist in real life and should be represented in fiction, especially that fiction delivered to children and young viewers. But in the same way, animated narratives as a whole also have a responsibility to interrogate the more nuanced aspects of antagonism and evil. It is necessary for a young audience to realize that some people are not born evil or purely malicious with no chance of redemption. It is important to understand that some people are turned antagonistic by the abuse that they are dealt or the system that they had to adapt to. Cartoon villains who are written three-dimensionally with motives for their actions can show children just how close the objectively good heroes are to the people that they fight against. And that is the idea behind Mrs. Claus, except taken to a higher level. This is the reverse of the redeemed villain, which is a common trope in children's animation. Here we have a quintessential Western paragon of virtue, the Claus family, Santa and his wife, turned into monsters. Santa, as pure and wholesome as he is not above being turned into a monster. And Miss Claus being the villain not because of her vampiric status as an other is super big and subversive and a departure from traditional fiction. Narratives aimed at younger and teenage audiences often make the villainy boil down to some innate facet of a person's being that they did not get to choose. Heck, this type of thing is super common in fantasy. Lord of the Rings has the orcs literally born evil and corrupt. Even Game of Thrones had the asinine argument that Daenerys was predisposed to madness because of her relationship to her father, which I'm not even going to get into how insulting it is to say that children of criminals and abusers are doomed to a self-fulfilling, self-destructive prophecy. This stereotype in storytelling has helped to aid the construction of prejudiced mindsets by attributing negative qualities of an individual as intrinsic components to the group that individual belongs to. Thankfully, recent narratives, especially animation, have been fighting back against this sort of narrative theme, but there is still a lot of work to be done. Mrs. Claus was a vampire, and we see through her and Baron von Gulick that doesn't actually mean anything innately negative. It's this really cool idea that those you see as others are actually not so different from you on a fundamental level and can be coexisted with harmoniously and even lovingly. The like kinds trope has been very pervasive in the media and storytelling for a while now. A lot of narratives attempt to make romantic interest reflections of each other to show their unity, either by making them transform physically, mentally, or both. But the storyline for Billy and Mandy wasn't curing Mrs. Claus of her vampirism to be human like Santa, or giving Santa back his intelligence so that he could be a functional vampire like Mrs. Claus. The conflict spurred from the dysfunction of their relationship and the unaddressed issues that had plagued their marriage for years. Miss Claus would turn her husband into a vampire against his will, and then trap him in a basement while she starved him, causing him to froth at the mouth in a vicious bloodlust. And I know the resolution to the film where Santa eats the Christmas cookies to turn back into a human is meant to be like thematic and philosophical and represent how the holiday spirit is the true essence of the cure. But I also think that on a much more simple and literal level, practically any type of food would have turned Santa back into a human. And I don't mean this in like a nitpicky, well, actually pedantic way. I mean that Billy literally just makes him like a regular batch of cookies, feeds it to Santa, and he's instantly cured. This is pretty clear evidence that Santa's ravenous anger and fury wasn't because he was a vampire. It's because he was literally starving to death and saw human flesh as a possible food source. I mean, we just see that vampires aren't head-empty, homicidal barbarians. They're just like normal people. Miss Claus was definitely starving her husband after locking him in a basement, which is consistent to her position, really. She's probably had to make every single meal in the household for the entirety of their centuries-long marriage. When she turns Santa into a vampire, she probably doesn't even think to make him food. I don't know how vampires work in this world, it's so wacky. But at the end of the day, Santa didn't love Mrs. Claus despite her being a vampire, as if it was some status as an other that was a negative. He simply saw it as a part of who she was and loved all of her. The Claus marital dysfunction had nothing to do with their interracial relationship, and everything to do with how they chose to deal with the dysfunction. Others only remain mysterious and evil when you don't know who they are. Just like how Santa and Mrs. Claus resolve their conflict, real relationships are built through open and honest communications. Those we see as outsiders have their own pains and struggles and joys and passions. Intermingling with them does not risk the perversion of your own identity, but allows the chance for it to grow into something even better and broader. The point of the meta-commentary and subversion in the Christmas special was meant to prime us to our own expectations and biases. It honestly kind of takes the absurdity of the Grim Adventures series as a whole in order to be able to pull this sort of narrative off. Make no mistake, a story like this could have never worked in a more traditional live-action setting or even in a more serious cartoon setting, at least not in 45 minutes. Billy and Mandy parlays its long-standing absurdity created by both animation and storytelling choices in order to put itself in the perfect position to execute a wacky, subversive, and honestly touching critique of pertinent social issues. I certainly wasn't expecting to get all of this out of Billy and Mandy Save Christmas when I sat down to watch it last month, but I'm certainly happy I did. Anyway, thanks for watching all the way until the end. If you like what you heard, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. If you really want to be a homie, support on Patreon or check out my website for editing services or my books. Links will be in the description below. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.